So may I introduce just this afternoon session? So we will start with Marie Guillot, who is a philosopher from the Université de Nanterre, and who will give a talk entitled Inserted Thought and the Phenomenal Concept Approach to D'essai Thought. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grégory, and Julien, and François, when he's back. So the aim of my talk today is to talk about the pathological case of thought insertion, or alien thought, as a kind of test case in a comparison of a couple of views regarding d'essai thoughts and the concept of self. D'essai thoughts here are understood as thoughts conferring ipseity on the subject in the following sense. In having such a thought, the subject can't fail to be aware that she herself is at issue in the thought, either in the sense that the thought is about her or in the sense that it concerns her or is true relative to her, to borrow John Perry's distinction. In at least some d'essai thoughts, those that are explicitly about the subject, this feature of ipseity plausibly flows from the fact that the subject uses a particular concept to think about herself, namely the concept of self. And the concept of self is the concept that each subject uses, not just to think about herself, the person she happens to be, but to think about herself, as Castaneda put it, which she may manifest by using first-person words. And so it's the concept that we use to reflect on and store information about ourselves, specifically the concept at play when we engage in introspection, self-criticism, action planning, and so on. I'll make two assumptions about the self-concept. One I call epistemic significance, and is just the assumption that using the self-concept in a thought, rather than some other concept, even if it refers to the same individual, makes a unique difference to the content of that thought, at some level of content that we can identify as the epistemic significance or cognitive value of the thought. So, for example, Rudolf Lingens famously can rationally judge, I am in the Stanford Library, without thinking Rudolf Lingens is in the Stanford Library, or the other way around. The other assumption I'll make, I call immediacy, and it's the following assumption. Mastering the self-concept entails having a disposition to apply it immediately on the basis of having any conscious mental state at all. So what I mean by this is one of the functions of the self-concept is surely to enable us to self-attribute our unconscious mental states. And I'm assuming that we can usually do this for free. As long as we master the concept of self and we are able to introspect our conscious mental states, we can usually move from having a conscious thought, T, or a conscious experience, E, more generally, to self-attributing it, judging I have E or I am thinking T, in a way that shows up as immediate at the personal level. Namely, the transition from a conscious mental state to its self-attribution doesn't generally require any additional evidence or inference, any kind of justification outside of that conscious experience. There are situations, however, where something interferes with or blocks the actualization of that disposition, and the case of alien thought I'm interested in today is precisely one of them. A brief bit of familiar taxonomy just for context. There are a number of different accounts of the type of mental representation involved in d'essai thought. These include, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but what we may call indexical accounts, and these will be my main focus here. I take those to be in some sense the classical, or anyway the most straightforward kind of accounts. And according to those approaches, d'essai thoughts involve a descriptive, token-reflexive concept referring to the subject as roughly the thinker of this very thought. So Zemar, Higginbotham, Howe, Carpintero, among others, defend this kind of view. Before them, there was Reichenbach, Benveniste, Russell, in some of his writings. There are also what we may call demonstrative accounts, according to which They say thoughts refer to their referent via something like a mental demonstrative. Daniel Morgan, in the Filiation of Evans, recently defended such an account. A non-negological account, according to which at least some d'essai thoughts do not involve an explicit representation of the self at all, but may be more aptly modeled as centered worlds or ways an individual might be. And examples of this sort, this family of approach include Lewis, Neenan, Recanati, Mushold, and others. So I'm not going to talk about these latter two types of accounts today. The second focus of the talk is D, on the slide, what I call phenomenal accounts. In those types of approaches, at least some d'essai thoughts are substantively anchored in phenomenal experience, or more specifically, the concepts of self those thoughts include is a kind of phenomenal concept. So Grünbaum, Peacock, Capitan, Castaneda go in that direction, and I've defended a version of that sort of view in a couple of places. Here's the plan. In the first part of the talk, I will argue that thought insertion can motivate an objection against indexical types of accounts. And this objection is based on the assumption that what Boghossian has called epistemic transparency is true, and that it applies to schizophrenic patients as well as to neurotypical patients, subjects. And in the second part of the talk, I'll argue that thought insertion, on the other hand, provides some degree of support for a phenomenal type of accounts, and I'll defend a version of this type of accounts, and I'll try to show that it can face the challenge from thought insertion. So the indexical account. So what I call the indexical account here covers, in a somewhat simplified way, a range of views according to which the I concept is an analog in the mental realm to the indexical word I in our linguistic practice. Indexicals in language determine their reference on each occasion of utterance by exploiting contextual facts about that very utterance. So whenever an utterance U of the word I is made, for example, the conventional meaning conveyed is roughly the speaker of this utterance, U of I. And in this description, the value of the utterance U is supplied by the context as the very utterance which also expresses the meaning under consideration. More generally, the standing meaning of indexicals is captured by descriptions of a special kind, like the speaker of this utterance U of I, which make reference to the tokens of the expressions themselves, and for this reason, these expressions are sometimes called token reflexives. On the indexical approach to the I concept, the same kind of token reflexivity is made use of in the mind as in speech. So where the word I exploits linguistic tokens, the concept of self exploits mental tokens, occurrent thoughts. And a token T of the self concept in a thought determines as its referent the individual who happens to be bearing the relation X is the thinker of T to that token T of the concept. Furthermore, according to the indexical model, and this is an important feature, this token reflexive reference rule is what we entertain in using the concept of self. In other words, the epistemic significance of the concept of self is identified with a special kind of description, being the thinker of this very thought, to simplify somewhat. Now, this is a side note, but contemporary proponents, at least of an indexical approach, usually go for a two-tiered account inspired by Kaplanian semantics. They equate the token reflexive description, being the thinker of this very thought, with the epistemic significance of the concept of self, but not with its extensional content, which is just the individual being referred to on each occasion in a rigid manner. So to grasp the concept is to grasp the description, being the thinker of this very thought, but to apply it on a particular occasion is to refer to the individual answering to the description in this instance, rather than to the condition expressed by the description. Okay. So, I take this to be the standard account of the concept of self in some sense, precisely because it stems directly from the reference rule for the concept of self, which is a rule of self-reference. The condition an individual has to satisfy for being the reference of a token of the self-concept is to be the person who thinks the token of the concept. And then the token reflexive account, the indexicalist account, simply equates that reference rule with the epistemic significance of the concept, what one has to grasp to think of the referent under that concept. So it's in some way, it's in this sense, the most simple and straightforward approach. It has that simplicity and elegance to recommend it. And you might think that the account secures ipseity because it has the consequence that no one can use the I concept without thereby thinking of oneself descriptively as the person who is thinking the present thought, which might seem close enough to ipseity, at least initially. And the account satisfies the plausible assumption of epistemic significance, the idea that the self-concept makes a unique difference to a thought's content, by identifying a specific epistemic significance attaching to the concept, namely the token reflexive description is the thinker of this very thought. And the account seems to tie in with the other reasonable assumption I've made at the start, namely immediacy. Intuitively, once we're equipped with the right concepts, we can move for free from a conscious thought T to the thought. The thinker of this is thinking T, in the sense that this transition shows up as immediate at the personal level. Now, what is the challenge from thought insertion for this kind of account? Thought insertion is among a range of delusions that can justify a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Inserted thoughts or alien thoughts are thoughts often with unpleasant contents that the subject reports as occurring in her stream of consciousness, but which nonetheless she refuses to acknowledge as her own. So typically, the patient also has an impression that someone else produced those thoughts and put them in her mind. Here are some characteristic first-person reports. First, refusals to acknowledge a thought as one's own. He said, it's like a thought as it comes in. It's a light feeling where you feel as though I'm actually thinking it, or you're receiving it, rather. I wonder if it's me. If that's me, it felt like a piece of information. And later the patient went on, you find it strange when some different little thought filters through. I don't think that was mine. You can differentiate. And then she said that sometimes it seemed to be her own thought, but I don't get the feeling that it is. She said her own thoughts might say the same thing, but the feeling isn't the same, and so on and so forth. Now move on to other attributions. One evening, the thought was given to me electrically that I should murder Lissy. Another patient report, thoughts come into my head like, kill God. It's just like my mind working, but it isn't. They come from this chap, Chris. They're his thoughts. And a final one, I look out of the window and I think the garden looks nice and the grass looks cool. But the thoughts of Eamon Andrews, media personality, come into my mind. There are no other thoughts there, only his. He treats my mind like a screen and flashes his thoughts onto it, like you flash a picture. So, others have suggested that thought insertion is a prima facie problem for indexicalists. Nosek, Recanati, Higginbotham, not necessarily quite under those terms, but thinking about close enough scenarios. What I want to do today is try to formulate the objection more fully by using Bogosian's notion of transparency of content. And this will hopefully show what I think is a source of the strength of the objection, namely some plausible assumptions about rationality, and then enable me next to argue for another type of account of the self-concept, which I think is immune to the objection. So, epistemic transparency. Boghossian defends the view that the content of our representations has to be in some sense transparent. He traces this insight back to Michael Domet, who says the following: it is an undeniable feature of the notion of meaning, obscure as that notion is, that meaning is transparent in the sense that if someone attaches a meaning to each of two words, he must know whether these meanings are the same. And Boghossian defends a related claim about meaning in the case of mental content. He says the following: the thesis of the epistemic transparency of content may be usefully broken up into two parts. A, if two of a thinker's token thoughts possess the same content, then the thinker must be able to know a priori that they do. And B, if two of a thinker's token thoughts possess distinct contents, then the thinker must be able to know a priori that they do. Call the first the thesis of the transparency of sameness, and the second, the thesis of the transparency of difference. So, as Boghossian sums it up, epistemic transparency is the principle according to which, for any two of her occurrent thoughts, a thinker can know a priori whether they have the same or distinct contents. What is the motivation for accepting such a principle? Domet took it to be self-evident and inseparable from the notion of meaning itself. Boghossian justifies the principle by reference to a practice of assessing people's rationality and explaining their behavior. Regarding rationality, he says the following: what does a person have to do in order to count as a good reasoner? Clearly, it is not at all a question of knowing empirical facts, of having lots of justified true beliefs about the external world. Rather, it is a matter of being able and of being disposed to make one's thoughts conform to the principles of logic on an a priori basis. So, for instance, being rational means avoiding contradictions of the form x is p and x is not p. But the point is, we are not in a position to discriminate between a subject being guilty of contradiction by accepting two thoughts whose contents can't be true at the same time, and, on the other hand, the subject avoiding contradiction, if we don't take for granted that the subject can grasp a priori whether the two contents are different or the same. So a subject is being illogical if she says x is p and x is not p, only if she grasps the meaning of x, p, and not p. And importantly for Boghossian, the principle of epistemic transparency applies to the level of concepts, but not to the referential level. One can, without contradiction, say that Cicero is bold, but Tully is not bold, because Cicero and Tully are two different concepts being used to refer to the same person. So the subject has a priori access to the epistemic significance of the concepts, even though their reference may be opaque to her. So someone who is rational, in short, can tell a priori if any two of her thoughts possess the same or different concepts. Applying this idea of epistemic transparency to the concept of self, we have the following two special cases, particular cases: transparency of sameness for the they say and transparency of difference for the they say. If two of a thinker's they say thoughts possess the same content, then she must be able to know a priori that they do have the same content. And transparency of difference for the they say. If two of a thinker's thoughts refer to her and their respective contents differ only in the respect that one refers to her under the concept of self and the other under a different concept, then the thinker must be able to know a priori that they are different thoughts in the sense of having different contents. Now, given epistemic transparency, thought insertion raises a challenge to the indexical account of the concept of self specifically. Let's go back to a typical patient report to see this. Thoughts come into my head like kill God. It's just like my mind working, but it isn't. They come from this chap, Chris. They're his thoughts. So why might this be a challenge for any view of the self-concept, given that the alien thought here, kill God, does not include a token of the self-concept at all, one may ask. So it takes a bit of work to get there. the key point is that while the patient is consciously thinking, kill God, it seems to them that someone else, not themselves, is thinking the thought. Now, suppose that the report on the alien thoughts could be made in a way that were exactly contemporaneous to the thoughts. Then the thought would be expressed as, the thinker of these very thoughts, Chris, as so happens in the patient's report, is thinking kill God. And while reporting that thought in this way, if the report were contemporaneous with the alien thought, the patient would also refuse to endorse the thought, I am thinking kill God. More generally, a patient with thought insertion is presumably able to think in thinking an alien thought. The thinker of this very thought is thinking P without endorsing the thought, I am thinking P. So this refusal is puzzling for any account of the self-concept if we accept what I think is a plausible principle of immediacy, namely, in acquiring the self-concept, you also acquire a disposition to apply it immediately without further justification on the basis of having any kind of conscious mental state. And it's a puzzle because, one, the patient is competent with the self-concept, as shown by correct uses of the concept throughout the patient reports that I've quoted, so they have mastered that concept. And the alien thoughts are conscious mental states. So, given immediacy, we need an explanation of why schizophrenics are not able to self-attribute the alien thoughts immediately, or indeed at all, and suffer from that delusion. But the reluctance to self-ascribe the alien thoughts is particularly problematic for indexicalist accounts. Why? Well, this is because, according to the indexical accounts, A, the thinker of these very thoughts is thinking P, and B, I am thinking P, have the same content. And this creates a special difficulty for the indexicalist account if we accept epistemic transparency, because given this principle of transparency, the patient should be able to know a priori that they do have the same content. But the patient doesn't know or even believe that A and B have the same content. So A and B don't have the same contents if epistemic transparency is true. So let me unpack this a little. Generally, a patient who has a given alien thought, P, is plausibly, other things equal, able to move with immediacy from a conscious thought P to the thinker of this very thought is thinking P, if they have the relevant concepts. That's a very small step from just the observation that the patient is able to introspect while having the alien thoughts. They can think of individual thoughts as they show up in their stream of consciousness, as evidenced in the reports by expressions such as a thought as it comes in, some little thought filters through, thoughts come into my head. And they are able to attribute those thoughts to thinkers. They say things like, feel as though I'm actually thinking it, they're his thoughts, etc. So put those two things together, and it seems harmless, I think, to assume that the patient could think something like, the thinker of this very thought is thinking P. That's not going much beyond the content, the material in the reports. But the patient is able to think the thinker of this very thought is thinking P, in this paraphrase, while rejecting the thought, I am thinking P, or the thinker of the, I am thinking P. Now, a crucial point in the objection is that patients presenting with thought insertion have, other things equal, intact rational faculties and an intact mastery of concepts. There is not a full consensus on that, but it is standard in psychology to describe delusions, including thought insertion, as broadly rational responses to abnormal experiences. So Davies and Coulthard approach delusion in that way. And that's kind of the canonical way of thinking of delusion. It's not that someone who has alien thoughts is irrational. It's just that they have a very strange impression that they're trying to rationalize as best they can. So, and this is a key point, the principle of epistemic transparency applies to the subject. They're as rational as a neurotypical subject, and so they should be able to know, we should assume that they can know a priori the difference or sameness of the content of their thoughts, given their rationality. So remember what transparency of sameness is about. If two of the thinker's thoughts possess the same content, then she must be able to know a priori that they do have the same content. And in particular, as applied to the décès, if two of the thinker's décès thoughts possess the same content, then she must be able to know a priori that they do have the same content. According to a token reflexive account, A and B are two décès thoughts with the same content. So on the one hand, the thinker of this very thought is thinking kill God, and on the other hand, I am thinking kill God. Those on the account are two décès thoughts with the same content. So given epistemic transparency and given that we can take the patient to be rational, the patient should be able to know that A and B have the same content just by considering the question. But in fact, they believe the opposite, so they don't have a priori knowledge that A and B have the same content. So A and B don't have the same content. I propose then that the delusion of thought insertion in subjects who are otherwise rational warrants treating the thinker of this very thought is thinking P and I am thinking P as involving different, although co-referential contents. And this implies that the thinker of this very thought and I stand for different concepts. If they were the same concept, then by the transparency of sameness, the subject would be able to tell a priori that they do have the same content, and she would not detect a difference in epistemic significance between A and B. So the suggestion is that having a genuine décès thought requires more or something different from the capacity to use a token reflexive concept to think of the person who happens to be oneself. Because that's, again, a patient with thought insertion can do without thereby thinking of herself, without thereby taking herself to think a thought she would express with the word I. A quick word about, this goes beyond what I'm going to try to do in the talk today, but I want to at least gesture very tentatively towards a way that this kind of objection might possibly generalize. It could potentially be extended in a weaker form to any account of the self-concept which defines it in broadly functional terms as the concept whose function is to enable us to think about the person who is thinking the thought. If that's what's defining, then I think thought insertion does pose a problem. The extension of the objection would start from what a reflexive subject who understands the function of the concept self would have to think about its content. A subject who is rational, masters the concept of self, and has a reflective understanding of it as, broadly, the concept whose function is to enable us to think about the person who is thinking the thought. Such a subject could not think the thinker of this thought is thinking P without feeling guilty of contradiction if they didn't at the same time accept I am thinking P. But based on the reports from schizophrenics, my sense is that there is in fact no contradiction in their eyes here. The patients report a strange impression, a feeling of alienation. It's like a light feeling, you find it strange, some different little thought. But they don't report a sense of their capacity to think coherently breaking down. That's not what seems to be happening in their eyes. So this is just gesturing towards something going a bit beyond the objection against indexical accounts in particular, but I think this is at least a preliminary consideration against any attempt to tie too closely the concept of self to token reflexive descriptions, either in spelling out the epistemic significance of the concept, or in defining it more broadly as the concept whose function it is to track the thinker. So I think what we need is an account of the self-concept that starts from a very different angle. The hypothesis I want to defend to do that is that the concept of self is not an indexical concept, but rather a phenomenal concept of a certain kind. So that's an account that I've defended in a couple of places. And more specifically, what I want to argue is that the concept of self is anchored in the way that phenomenal concepts of a certain kind are, in a distinctive piece of phenomenology, which I call self-experience or meanness. So, phenomenal concepts are experience-dependent. They have what we may call a phenomenal basis. They're partly individuated in terms of a way of being appealed to. And, of course, there's controversy about what exactly that amounts to. But a possible way to capture pure phenomenal concepts, namely those experience-dependent concepts that we used to think about experiences themselves, might be this. So here I'm adapting lightly three conditions proposed by Xi. There is a way to characterize pure phenomenal concepts in the following way. A person X's concept C is what I propose to call a pure phenomenal concept, namely a concept that is phenomenal, a phenomenal concept, and that we used to think about our experiences themselves, if and only if it satisfies a certain acquisition condition, namely acquiring C requires X to instantiate or to have instantiated phenomenal property F. It also satisfies a condition on the application of the concept. On acquiring the concept C, X has the disposition to apply C non-inferentially in virtue of instantiating the phenomenal property F. So that's similar to the notion of immediacy I've introduced at the start. And third, there is a condition on reference. C refers to F or particular instantiations of F. So that's all familiar. An important point which Papineau and Gertler have emphasized is that we can in fact form experience-dependent concepts not just to think about our experiences themselves, as we do with pure phenomenal concepts, defined in the way that I've just proposed, but also we can form experience-dependent concepts to think about other objects that we are presented with through the experiences. For instance, their causal origin. We can think about individuals or the natural kinds which sit at the causal origin of the experiences. Papineau calls those types of concepts perceptual concepts, and he gives examples such as types of birds, for example, or types of trees that we can classify on the basis of the way they appear to us. And Gertler talks about perceptual demonstratives for concepts that use the phenomenal way an object is given to us to categorize this object. So the more general point is that there's a robust sense in which more concepts count as phenomenal concepts than pure phenomenal concepts, those that we used to think about experiences themselves. And the way in which this broader category of phenomenal concept still counts as experience-dependent in a robust and interesting sense can be captured in the first two of the three conditions I've slightly adapted from Xi, namely the acquisition condition and the immediate application condition. If a concept is such that to acquire it, you have to instantiate or have instantiated a certain phenomenal property, if having acquired it, you are in a position to apply it immediately, without further justification, just by virtue of having that property, that phenomenal property again, then that counts as a phenomenal concept, and that's sufficient to make it stand out among other kinds of what we may call empirical concepts. So my view is that the self-concept is a phenomenal concept in that second, broader sense, and that it has a specific phenomenal basis, namely self-experience. There is arguably a distinctive experience that comes with being a subject. Let's call this self-experience. So Kriegel and Levine, for example, observe that when we experience the world, we generally experience ourselves too. So when I stroke a cat, there is a certain qualitative character to my experience, a sort of silky, warm way that it's like to feel the cat. But the experience also has what Kriegel and others call a subjective character. There's a way that I am phenomenally aware of myself as myself in being aware of the cat. So this is the way that I'll understand self-experience, namely as a phenomenal way that I'm presented with myself as myself. And I won't enter the debate of whether that's present in every experience, but I will assume that at least most normal experiences of the world come with self-experience. And I'll also assume that self-experience is the same across all the modalities in which one can be self-aware. So by introspecting one's thoughts, feeling one's body from the inside, but also by having intentions, perceiving objects in the outer world, or being in any other kind of conscious mental state. I'll make some distinctions that I've argued for before. In the literature, this experience of self is sometimes insufficiently clearly distinguished from adjacent types of phenomenology. The different terms in which self-experience is discussed in the literature, there is a sample here: subjectivity, forminess, mindness, pre-reflective self-awareness, the sense of self, etc. These terms often target different things. So authors in the field agree that to capture the phenomenology of being aware of an experience, we need to mention the subject of the experience, but the subject can occupy at least 3 different roles when she is aware of having an experience. She can be thought of as the one who is appeared to, who is aware of the experience. And it is an interesting fact that for there to be something it is like, for there to be an experience at all, there has to be a subject being appeared to. There has to be someone for whom this is an experience. So this phenomenon, I think, is what interests Kriegel, for example, and this I propose to call for-me-ness. But the subject can also be thought as the one who is appearing, as opposed to being appeared to, appearing to herself in being aware of the experience. And this I call me-ness, and it seems to me that it's significantly different. But there is also a more complex role for the subject, namely being the one who is appearing to herself as the owner of the experience. So this is what I call mindness. And being aware of oneself as the owner of an ongoing experience seems to be, at least conceptually, a more complex relation than just being aware of oneself. Because being aware of oneself as the owner of an ongoing experience involves, in the subject of experience, 3 things. An awareness of the experience, as in for-me-ness, an awareness of herself, as in me-ness, and also an awareness of the relation of ownership between the two, the experience and the self. So I think it's important to keep me-ness and mine-ness separate as far as possible. Now, if there is such a thing as self-experience or me-ness, a way that the subject is given to herself as herself in experience, then it is available as a potential phenomenal anchor for a dedicated phenomenal concept. And I think it's plausible that the concept in question does exist, and that it is precisely the self-concept. So I can think of myself under the self-concept by experiencing what it's like to be me. The suitability of this model of phenomenal concepts to the self-concept might not seem immediately obvious because I think largely because the discussion of phenomenal concepts has largely been dominated by examples of pure phenomenal concepts, such as concepts of pain or reddishness, which refer to experiences, but on the other hand, the self-concept refers not to an experience, but to a subject of experiences, namely me. However, remember the point from a few minutes ago, as emphasized by Papineau and Gertler, not all phenomenal concepts refer to experiences. We can use our experiences to think about those experiences themselves, but also to think about objects that we are presented with through the experiences, such as kinds or kind members or individuals, in a way that is still robustly anchored in experiences. Now, here is my proposal. The self-concept is a phenomenal concept, although not a pure phenomenal concept, and it has meanness as its phenomenal basis. There's an important difference to note, I'll do this briefly, with the kinds of non-pure phenomenal concepts that Papineau and Gertler discuss, perceptual demonstratives, or perceptual concepts. So, like the phenomenally dependent concept of a green finch or a birch tree, for example. In the case of those concepts of random, ordinary, empirical objects, it's not essential to, for example, being a green finch, that a green finch phenomenally appears to us the way it does. There are cases of misreference or anti-reference under the phenomenally grounded concepts of green finch or birch tree. So there are cases when we have the phenomenal impression as of a green finch, but no green finch is there. Maybe it's just a decoy, maybe it's an hallucination. And there are occasions when there is a green finch, but we have the phenomenal impression as of something else, like a swift or a blackbird. By contrast, it seems plausible that it's essential to being me that I am phenomenally given to myself in the way that I am. Whoever appears to me in self-experience, I find it plausible to think, that is me. That's what it is to be a self, and this particular self. Another way to put this is to say, using Goff's notions, that the self-concept partly reveals its reference, or is in some sense translucent. So I won't elaborate this, but I believe that this kind of metaphysical assumption can explain at least some of the peculiar semantic and epistemic properties that have traditionally been attached to the self-concept and that don't attach to concepts like that of a green finch. Now, to go back to the main point, I'm proposing that the self-concept is a phenomenal concept whose phenomenal basis is meanness, and this implies that meanness is typically part of what I grasp when I grasp the self-concept, at least in core uses of the concept. It's constitutive of its epistemic significance, and in that sense of its content. And once I have acquired the self-concept on the basis of attending to the meanness of my experience, then I can normally, everything going well, apply the concept on the mere basis of having this experience, and I can apply it to refer to a specific individual, namely the individual who is presented to me in the meanness of the experience used on this occasion to activate the concept. How does this type of account fare when it comes to trying to face the challenge from thought insertion? So there is a debate on how thought insertion should be understood and explained. Again, it is a delusion, and delusions tend to be understood not by everyone, but standardly as rational responses to abnormal experiences. So the question is, which abnormal experience helps us classify the delusions? And if in particular the thought insertion delusion can be viewed as a rational response to an unusual experience, then the question is, what abnormality exactly is there in experience that gives rise to it? We have several types of accounts of thought insertion in the literature. One that we may call the simple account, defended by Metzinger, which interprets thought insertion as a case where a subject lacks what he calls a sense of ownership over her thoughts. Then what is now in some way the standard account of thought insertion is one that treats it rather as a case where the subject does have a sense of ownership over her thoughts, and that claim is motivated by the fact that patients with thought insertion can introspect those thoughts as they have first-person access to them. But the claim is that they lack a sense of agency over their thoughts. They lack a sense of having actively produced those thoughts. And a third type of account construes alien thoughts as cases where the subject fails to endorse the content of her thoughts or commit to them. That's the sort of account that Bortolotti has defended. A reason which is often given for rejecting the simple account, where alien thoughts are just mental states that are unaccompanied by a feeling of ownership, is that the patient returns first-person access to those thoughts. She wouldn't deny that the alien thoughts occur in her stream of consciousness. But I suspect that this case for rejecting the simple account rests in part on the failure to distinguish between the different notions of subjective character that I have distinguished earlier. The concept of a sense of ownership generally is used generally in that literature in a way that doesn't discriminate between a special way that we are aware of our experiences, namely first-personally, in a way that nobody else can be aware of them. Second, a way that we are aware of ourselves in having experiences, namely me-ness, as distinguished from me-ness. And third, a way that we are aware of owning those experiences, namely mine-ness. But once we disentangle those three things, it becomes possible to conjecture that the abnormal thoughts are given to a schizophrenic patient with thought insertion in a first-personal way, thus exhibiting for-me-ness, while still leaving room for the hypothesis that the patient might be specifically lacking a sense of owning those thoughts. She might be lacking mine-ness in her experience. And note further that schizophrenics with thought insertion nonetheless seem to retain a phenomenal awareness of themselves, me-ness, while having the problematic thoughts. This is shown by the fact that there's some perfectly normal uses of first-person terms in their reports, and that those uses are plausibly not just retrospective, but seem to attest to the fact that there was continued self-awareness throughout the experience. To read again one of the patient reports from earlier, the thoughts of Eamon Andrews come into my mind. There are no other thoughts there, only his. He treats my mind like a screen and flashes his thoughts onto it like you flash a picture. So there's some perfectly correct uses of the first person in the reports. So in what amounts to a version of the simple account, I propose that one available way of thinking of thought insertion, one possible way of describing thought insertion, is as a condition in which experience lacks mine-ness, but retains both for-me-ness and me-ness. While a normal experience which comes with both meanness and mindness usually puts us in a position to immediately self-attribute the experience, an alien thought is experienced by the patient as abnormal because it lacks a sense of mindness, and this makes her reluctant to self-attribute it, even though she has the competence to do it. So she does have the disposition to immediately self-attribute any conscious mental thought, but something, namely the unusual experience, blocks the disposition from being actualized on this occasion. So that's a possible reconstruction of what might be going on there, and what is the nature of the strange impression that the patient is doing their best to rationalize. So how does this account of alien thought tie in with the phenomenal concept model of the self-concept to face the challenge from epistemic transparency? That will be my last question. So, my hypothesis, again, is that in thought insertion, there's something abnormal in the experience. There is a deficiency in the subjective character of the experience, which targets selectively the mindness of the experience, but leaves intact its meanness and its forminess. So the subject retains her capacity to self-refer through the delusion, but not the capacity to self-attribute her experience straightforwardly or without reluctance. Hence, the denials of ownership combined with correct uses of I. Again, it's just like my mind working, but it isn't. They come from this chap, Chris, they're his thoughts. You find it strange when some different little thought filters through. I don't think that was mine. It seemed to be your own thought, but I don't get the feeling that it is. The feeling is that it is somebody else's. It was being put into me, into my mind, and so on. This, on the phenomenal account of the self-concept, does not amount to a violation of epistemic transparency, and thus doesn't require treating the schizophrenic patient as irrational. Compare again A and B. The thinker of these very thoughts is thinking, kill God. While reporting that thought in this paraphrased, reconstructed way, the patient would refuse to endorse the further thought, I am thinking, kill God. On the phenomenal concept model, there is no difficulty here because A and B are understood to differ in their epistemic significance, and the patient just knows it. The I in B is not equated with the thinker of these very thoughts in A. What is grasped in grasping I is not a token reflexive description, but rather a piece of phenomenology presenting me with a person, myself. And this leaves room for failing to recognize that the concept I and the concept of the person thinking these very thoughts are concepts of the same person, while remaining rational. So what's happening here is that sameness of difference is illustrated rather than, transparency of difference is illustrated rather than transparency of sameness being violated. There may be a remaining sense of some tension. How could you possibly accept A but not B? I think insofar as there is the sense of a remaining tension, that comes from the fact that A and B are co-referential, and that there is all going well immediacy. If it wasn't for the presence of an abnormal experience that blocks the disposition to self-attribute the conscious thought, the experience, then the patient would accept B as well as A. Alien thought is very unusual, and of course is involves an abnormal experience. I am going to skip a word I was going to, something I was going to say about the sense in which the patient's knowledge might count as a priori, to go a bit more quickly. And I'll jump to conclusions. So the indexical model of the self-concept has the advantage of being straightforward, as it identifies the epistemic significance of the self-concept and what the subject grasps in grasping the concept, with the reference rule for the concept, namely the rule that a token of the concept refers to the subject who thinks that very token of the concept. So what you have to grasp to use the concept just is the condition a person has to satisfy to be the referent of the concept. But I've argued that this model fails to adequately deal with a challenge raised by the delusion of thought insertion. Thought insertion shows us that it is possible to think the thinker of this very thought is thinking P without thereby endorsing the thought I am thinking P. And I've proposed that on the reasonable assumption that epistemic transparency is true, so that for any two of our thoughts which have the same content in the sense of involving all of the same concepts connected in the same way, this possibility in subjects who are otherwise rational warrants treating the thinker of this very thought is thinking P and I am thinking P as involving different contents. So this means that I doesn't have the same content as the thinker of this very thought. I've also proposed that this difference in meaning can be captured by a model on which the concept of self is a type of phenomenal concept. And on this model, a subject thinking a décès thought thinks of herself not as the person thinking these very thoughts, but via a way that she's phenomenally given to her as me, where this isn't the same thing as being given to herself as the owner of the occurrent thought. On this type of approach, I've argued that thought insertion is not an insurmountable challenge, and that, on the contrary, this is my final thought, since thought insertion is caused by an abnormal experience and interferes with the subject's willingness to deploy their self-concept, it may be seen as giving some degree of support to views that see the self-concept as experience-dependent. And that's all from me.